So, as some of you know, there are two covers to my book. One is British and one is American, because it was published in both countries, but slightly different versions. The American cover, and it's a book about British leadership, the men who lost America, has a haughty British commander pointing into the distance, with a junior commander looking up to him, almost as if to say, "What are you thinking of?" And they just have my middle name, which is Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy, which makes me sound very American. And then it has a subtitle, British Leadership, the American Revolutionary War, and the Fate of the Empire. Now, the American version is different, or rather the British version is different. Instead of just the two commanders, it has the same painting of the Siege of Gibraltar, but it has a different perspective. It's a much larger scene, showing these victorious redcoats looking like a rugby scrum winning a war. Because as British publishers told me, the British aren't interested in reading about defeats, and they have very little interest in the American Revolution. This they do not regard as their golden age. My name on the book is just Andrew O'Shaughnessy. It has to be said, the British don't really use their middle names. It's important in America. Think of Harry Truman. He had to invent a middle initial. Nevertheless, it was also deliberate. And then the subtitle of the book is different as well. Instead of British leadership, it's British command. And that word has a slightly different tone. And instead of the fate of the empire, it's the preservation of the empire. Because they were very keen to remind people that this war was ultimately a victory against France. So the book is written against a very popular idea that the British lost the war through bad leadership. It's an idea that the British themselves promoted right after the war, and even during the war, the commanders blamed each other. It's always seemed to me an odd idea for Americans because it gives the impression, it sort of diminishes American leadership, the idea that it's just incompetent aristocratic buffoons from Britain that lost the war rather than the idea that the patriots won it. It's an idea that you get in the movies. The one that I often show a clip from is The Patriot, in which Cornwallis is shown as more concerned with his dogs and his clothing and sartorial elegance than winning the war. He keeps complaining about this horse blanket he's forced to wear. And in fact, he's wearing this magnificent scarlet uniform and always in headquarters. Now, I knew that the real Cornwallis was very much like the modern day military. He lived for the army. He said, "The army is my life." He discarded all of his tents and blankets while he was in North Carolina and lived out in the open and slept out in the open. And his private soldiers admired him because he suffered the same sacrifices as they did. He also went on to have a very successful career because he was young enough. It's an image perpetuated in popular history. Barbara Tuchman, The March of Folly, a third of it, is dedicated to this caricature of the British leadership. She was the most popular historian in the 1970s. It's called The March of Folly. It's best understood as a book against war in general. The whole idea of the book is all war is stupidity, and the people she chooses, she sees as extreme examples of that stupidity. But it also makes it into the academic literature as well, words like hidebound and incompetent. And so what I'm concerned with is that this idea distracts from the real reasons why the British won the war. Of course, in retrospect, they wouldn't make all the same decisions, but those decisions generally were based on the information available at the time, and they're justifiable decisions. And so what I really want to leave you with today is an explanation of why they lost. But let me just introduce you briefly to the leaders themselves. And I deal with them rather like a play, and introduce them when they're critical to the action, and they are key decision makers, both political and military. The first, of course, is George III, who, even in the 19th century, his very name would be booed on the American stage. He was, of course, cast as the chief villain of the whole conflict, not least by Thomas Jefferson, who describes him as a tyrant in the Declaration of Independence. And 2/3 of that declaration, the lines begin with he, a series of accusations personally made against George III. It's amusing that John Adams, in his 80s, wrote to Jefferson and said, "I think you got that wrong," and that it was too personal an attack. And indeed, George III was not responsible for the policies that led to the war. Those were really the policies of his prime minister and his cabinet. But what I did find interesting about George III is he became Britain's leading war hawk, and that he was almost Churchillian. He would say, "If any 10 men stand beside me, I intend to go on." And what he does is to disprove an idea that many of the British populace have themselves, that they were never serious about this war, that this was just a minor conflict in the colonies. In actual fact, they were deadly serious. And George III, oddly, articulated their reasons better than any of the other leaders that whose works I read. He felt it was very important to the British because without America, they'd cease to be a major power. He understood the economic importance of America. He possibly even over-exaggerated the importance of America, but he felt so strongly about the war that he actually threatened to resign or to abdicate, as they say in the monarchical world. He twice wrote out his abdication speech. He moved his favorite residence to Windsor Castle and introduced a form of uniform at court and had military music played every evening. And after Yorktown, he said, "I'm determined to go on." That any Englishman who would support the idea of withdrawal from America is essentially a traitor to their country. And that was the point that he really seriously considered resigning. There are 9 other figures in the book. The first being Lord North, the Prime Minister, who today is known as the worst Prime Minister in British history, which is often used in Parliament. Sir or Madam, you are the worst Prime Minister since Lord North. Now, this is grossly unfair because Lord North was indeed responsible for the policies that led to the American Revolution, most famously the Tea Act. What he had never anticipated was the reaction to the Tea Act. He wasn't introducing new taxes. Lord North never introduced a tax. He inherited a revolutionary situation in America. His first day in Parliament was the day of the Boston Massacre. And so he couldn't understand why taking part of the duty off tea would actually help escalate the trouble in America. And he felt he had to react to the Boston Tea Party. But what I found unusual about Lord North is that having realized that there was a crisis and that the American colonies were united, he tried to retreat. He tried to negotiate a peace throughout the rest of the war. The best deal he offered was in the middle of the war, in anticipation of France joining, in which he offered no taxes and a repeal of all policies passed since the French and Indian War, and acknowledgement of the right of Congress. And that, I think, is very significant, because it means that for the second half of the war, Britain was only fighting for one thing, and that was to save its face, for token control of America. But Lord North is also unfairly treated because he was a great financier. He kept Britain buoyant during this war at a time when the French finance minister had to resign. North combined two modern-day jobs, what would be the Secretary of the Treasury in this country, as well as the leader of the House. And he had to negotiate every loan personally. The other aspect of him was he was a brilliant speaker and parliamentary manager, actually one of the best that Parliament has ever seen. And it's wonderful to read his speeches. He'd come into the House, not like David Cameron, for an hour each week. He would come in for 3 days a week when it was in session. He'd come in about noon, and he'd speak until, or be there, often until the early hours of the morning. He'd generally wait till almost the end of the debate and then give speeches of about 2 hours, with the intention of literally having the last word and not using a single note. What is more amazing is that he used to give his financial reports without notes, and it's probably the only time anyone has actually had an audience for financial reports, because people thronged the gallery just to see him give those reports. I mean, it was just a remarkable thing to witness. So far from being this sleepy figure who really didn't care, this was really quite a remarkable figure. What is true is that he concluded very early on that Britain was likely to lose, and essentially tried to persuade George III to cut his losses, or at least to let him resign. He spent the entire war trying to resign. In fact, in the middle of the war, the Prime Minister was trying to resign, the Commander-in-Chief was trying to resign, and the Deputy of the Commander-in-Chief was trying to resign, and George III was gung-ho. And then there is one chapter on two personalities, the only chapter on two people. These are the commanders at the very beginning of the war, or after Lexington and Concord, Sir William Howe and his brother, Lord Richard Howe. They have generally been criticized a lot because supposedly they commanded at a point when Britain could most easily have won this war, right at the beginning in 1776. And the point I would simply make about them is that although they were two brothers, they were not chosen on simply the basis of connections. The British skipped 105 more senior generals to choose Sir William Howe. And the reason was they knew this was going to be bush warfare, they knew it would be unconventional, and they wanted Howe because he had a background in light infantry, which today we would think of as commandos. He was a pioneer in that kind of warfare, and he'd served in America. In fact, he was next to Wolfe as he died at Quebec. He'd been at one of the great British military scenes of any period. And then his brother, Lord Richard Howe, was head of the Navy, which was not a coincidence. But it was not that the government was in any way wanting to just promote this family. In fact, the Admiralty did not want Lord Richard Howe. His brother insisted if he served in America, his older brother, the Admiral, must also serve. This was extremely smart because there was no joint chief of staff. The Navy and the Army were operated completely independently, and in order to get coordination, it was very useful to have his brother running the Navy. These two brothers together were quite brilliant. Even their critics acknowledge that. Lord Richard Howe was a pioneer in what's called amphibious warfare. That's using the Army and Navy together. He helped design these sort of flat-bottomed ships in which the bow would go forward and troops would run off, much like D-Day. These two brothers got 15,500 men and 40 cannon onto Staten Island on something like the 26th of August, in other words, at the height of New York summer, in 2.5 hours, which was remarkable for that time period. Also, Sir William Howe never lost a single battle against George Washington, which he personally commanded, and he defeated Washington at some of the largest battles of the American Revolution. And secondly, Lord Richard Howe is a wonderful example of the thin line between success and failure, because Lord Richard Howe went on to be Britain's greatest naval hero before Nelson. The third person in the book is John Burgoyne, the general who was defeated at Saratoga, which, as the ambassador mentioned, is really the turning point at which the French entered the war. All I would say about Burgoyne is he was a rising star in the British Army before the American Revolution. He was the next general after Sir William Howe, one of the most junior generals, and he'd been brilliantly successful. And this was a kind of aberration in his career. After Sir William Howe, I consider Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for America, the British official most responsible for conducting the war in America, and the man most blamed in British history and in American history for losing the war. There is remarkably only one biography of him, academic biography, which is remarkable. You think of all the work we have on the Confederacy during the American Civil War, and yet this is a key figure. There's one biography, and the biographer begins by saying, "I detest this man." And I can tell you that's very rare in biography. You usually work on people you like. But Germain was a veteran, and he was one of the great administrators. In fact, he simplified the whole system of administration. He had a staff of only 25, which is less than I have at Monticello. And yet, he got 35,000 people. I shouldn't tell Leslie this. He got 35,000 people out, not just from England, but from Ireland and Germany, out to America to join another 20,000 troops, bringing about 55,000 troops off the coast of New York, and almost as many sailors on board those ships. It required every ship in the British Navy, but he did it within a few months of taking office and had achieved it by the summer of 1776. William Knox, the great artillery officer, was sitting at his breakfast table at number 1 Broadway and looked out with his wife and said it was like a forest that had just arrived. Or to use the analogy for younger people today, this was like the war star, the imperial star appearing. This was larger than the largest city in America, which was Philadelphia, at 30,000. So that just gives you an idea of the scale. Then I consider Sir Henry Clinton, who succeeded Sir William Howe as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. And he too only has one biography. It happens to be very good, but it was written at the height of psychohistory in the 1960s. And essentially the biographer suggests that Clinton was a nutty neurotic. And there's a lot of truth in that. A former prime minister's son, who was just a young captain in the army, walked into Clinton's office just after he'd become commander-in-chief in New York, and Clinton was crying. And Clinton pointed at the sentry at the door and said, "I would rather be that man than in my position." And the point is, Clinton understood that the British could, and probably would, very likely lose this war. Far from being a neurotic, It's like the old psychiatrist joke. The good news is you are anxious. The bad news is you have much to be anxious about. This was not just being neurotic. This was a man who was being expected to win the war at a time when he had fewer troops than his predecessors, less naval support. The war had broken out with France, and then the following year with Spain, and then the following year after that with Holland, and then half of Europe was in a league of what it called armed neutrality, which was nothing but neutral. It was a very hostile alliance against Britain. Far from being very ordinary, Clinton was the most cerebral officer in the British Army. We know he was the best read officer in the British Army just from his books and notes on strategy and war. And he understood this war in ways that others did not. He understood one very key component, and I'll come back to this in my closing remarks. He said, we need to win the hearts and subdue the minds of America. In other words, he understood this was a war about hearts and minds. Opinion was all important, and winning support from people. It was no good just to win the war, and then for Britain to have the situation that it had in Ireland, where a third of its army was constantly based during peacetime. It was a garrison government. Britain couldn't afford, it didn't have the resources to do that. It had to essentially have popular support. And Clinton realized that the ministry was wrong in thinking that the support was there. He was one of the very few who from the beginning was questioning and doubting just how extensive the support was for the British in America. And he understood one other key element of this war, that the war at sea was critical to the outcome. And he wrote home as soon as he became commander-in-chief and said, the moment that there's a superior French fleet off the coast of America, any detachment of the British Army can be surrounded and besieged, which is exactly what happened in Yorktown. He was aware that the French and Americans had missed two earlier opportunities to defeat the British, but they'd been very close. One was in Newport, Rhode Island, and the other was in Georgia. It had always been a problem, especially as there were two foreign powers, for America and France to fully coordinate the fleet and military. It would have been a problem for the British even, except under the Howe brothers, where the two brothers could work easily together. Cornwallis is the last general that I discuss in the book. He, of course, was responsible for the final British defeat at Yorktown. I mentioned Cornwallis earlier in terms of the Patriot, that he's very much a modern-day professional soldier. His wife begged him not to leave home. She even tried to get his brother, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, to intercede with the government and just stop it. Supposedly, she died of a broken heart in the middle of the war. It does remind us that soldiers, just as today, made huge sacrifices to participate. Oddly enough, he'd never believed in the policies that led to the American Revolution, and that was true of the Howe brothers as well. The military was much less hawkish about America than the civilians, which is also often the case. But Cornwallis went on to a much more successful career in military terms after the war. And again, it reminds us, just like Lord Howe, of the thin line between success and failure. That success is not just based on personality. Resources, context are crucial. He went on to defeat the Great Irish Rebellion of 1798. He was also responsible for the great expansion of the British in India, and especially in the south of India, where he commanded battles that were much larger than those he'd commanded in America. And he was responsible, too, for introducing a much higher level of administration. Cornwallis was not the pompous personality as depicted in The Patriot. The irony is he was the most aristocratic of the generals. He was an earl, so his connections were impeccable, but he was the least pretentious. This was someone who did not like wearing scarlet uniforms. This was someone who refused to have security in Ireland and refused to live in the castle, but instead lived in Phoenix Park near the castle and was nearly assassinated. This was someone who in India dispensed with all the great ceremonies that the British were previously and certainly afterwards famous for, these great imperial displays. He would have none of it, as a sort of very down-to-earth figure. And finally, the last two chapters of the book are both naval figures, because the Navy is often underrated in terms of the importance that aspect. People tend to prefer writing about marches, about troops, about land operations that actually take place in America, but the naval aspect was critical. One person that no one would perhaps expect to find in the book, because he was not regarded as a failure, is Sir George Rodney, the Admiral. And he was not a failure. In fact, he came out of this war with his reputation actually enhanced, the only person to do so. And that's because during this war, he captured or defeated 3 enemy admirals from 3 different European countries. He killed the Dutch admiral and captured his flagship at San Eustatius. He defeated the Spanish admiral. It was a wonderfully named, romantically named battle called Moonlight Bay. And then he captured Admiral de Grasse and his battleship, the Ville de Paris, which had been built at the expense of Paris. It was a huge victory, one of the largest before Trafalgar. And he naturally became the great hero. In fact, the day of that battle, April the 12th, was celebrated right through to the early 19th century until it was replaced by Trafalgar. It's remarkable because de Grasse had inflicted really the great naval defeat on the British by France during the 18th century, and that was the Chesapeake Capes. That defeat allowed Washington and Rochambeau to surround and besiege Cornwallis. Without that French naval victory, Cornwallis could have escaped from Yorktown and gone back to fight another day in New York. So de Grasse had really been a major figure. And again, it reminds us of the thin line between success and failure, that de Grasse had been the successful admiral, but was later himself defeated by the British. Similarly, Horatio Gates, who won Saratoga for the Americans, was later defeated by Cornwallis in a lesser-known battle called Camden. And the final figure in the book is the Earl of Sandwich, who was generally known in history as a great libertine, a very dissolute character. He's also known, every time you have a snack in the English language and call it a sandwich, he was responsible for it. He liked to work hard, but as my earlier comment that he was a great libertine might suggest, he liked to play hard as well. And he would always then snack and just put meat between 2 pieces of bread. Sandwich is the other civilian most blamed for the British defeat. Why? Because this was the only war in the 18th century where the British lost a significant naval battle to the French. The British supposedly were to have a 2-power navy, which could both defeat Spain and France simultaneously. And yet the British Navy was not prepared, and it never really did quite add up to the full size of the combined French and Spanish fleets. But that was not Sandwich's fault. He'd been administering the Navy before most of the other politicians were born. And Sandwich had predicted to the government, if you don't mobilize immediately, you are likely to have an inadequate navy when war breaks out with France, and he knew and predicted that the war would break out with France. And instead of taking his advice, the government cut his budget. And a major reason the government does this, and again I'm going to refer to this briefly in my concluding remarks, is that the government did not want an arms race with France. In fact, they did not want France to get involved in this war, and therefore they deliberately did not mobilize their full army and navy at the beginning of this war. And one theme I want to return to is that the French were not just important in 1778 in the middle of the war, they were important from the very start and played a key role even when they supposedly were not an ally of the Americans. So those are the 10 leading characters, and of course part of the benefit of biographical sketches is that these were personalities, many entertaining stories about them individually, but the real message is, why did the British lose? And I'm just going to give you the very brief, what I often call the elevator pitch version after advertisers, of why they actually lost. And one of the key reasons that I argue is that the British had an army of conquest, not an army of occupation. That is, they were able to take every American city during this war, but they could never occupy territory. The most famous occasions they tried in New Jersey in the winter of 76-7, when they had created these cantonments across central New Jersey. They had half of New Jersey going right up to the Delaware, to Trenton. They were within hours of being able to attack Congress in Philadelphia, with the result that the Congress that had signed the Declaration of Independence actually fled Philadelphia for a while. And yet, by the end of that winter, they'd lost a third of their army. Obviously, Washington's incredibly courageous attack at Trenton and then at Princeton were part of that, but they lost most of those soldiers through foraging, going out looking for supplies and food during the winter, who would be attacked by small partisan bands. The problem was the British had never expected to occupy America. They only had the 5th largest army in Europe. It was never a large army, it never has been. I would remind all those British who are in favor of Brexit that essentially all Britain's victories in Europe have been as allies of other European countries. 1940 was the only time, because of the defeat in France, when essentially they were alone for any period. Other European allies have been key. In this war, they did not have that. They were fighting alone. Because they couldn't occupy territory, it meant that they didn't have land and therefore weren't able to grow their food in America. That meant everything: coal, candle supplies, food. 33 tons of it a day had to come from Britain. And essentially, they were still using a medieval system of administration. There were 5 different departments that dealt with the army. This was well above their ability to achieve. And so they couldn't do that in terms of their administrative capacity. But clearly, the fact that it turned into a world war in 1778, the British were overextended, their navy was overextended, they had to convoy their ships, their merchant ships everywhere, and there's where France was critical. The French provided money to the Patriots, and they've opposed Britain with the world's largest navy. After that of the British themselves. The role of France was very critical. I didn't realize I was going so much beyond my time, but thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Excellent.